Welcome to the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Information and Communication Standard Training module. Hereafter, this module will refer to the Act as the AODA. AODA Information and Communication Standard Training is a requirement of the AODA. The Information and Communication Standard Training was created for organizations and employers to train their employees and all other obligated persons about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. The content of this module is not legal advice, but does serve to satisfy the requirement for employers to train and educate their employees as required by the AODA. If there is a discrepancy between this training and the Act, or any amendments to the Act that arise after this training has been completed, the Act will always prevail. In this module, you will be provided with a brief overview of the AODA, as well as the 5 standards that make up the Act. You will learn about the general requirements of the Integrated Accessibility Standard, as well as the specific requirements that derive from the Information and Communication Standard. The standards will be reviewed in light of the requirements that are placed upon both the employer and the employees as imposed by the Act. Currently, 1.85 million people in Ontario have a disability. That's 1 in 7 people. Over the next 20 years, as the population ages, it is estimated that the number will rise to 1 in 5 Ontarians. People with disabilities do not have equal access to services, employment, transportation, information, or to some facilities that we all should be able to enjoy. The AODA was passed with the goal of creating standards to improve accessibility across the province. The AODA became law on June 13, 2005. The purpose of the legislation is ultimately to provide for accessible Ontario to people who have a disability. The legislation focuses on different key areas in succession: developing standards for customer service, information and communication, transportation, employment, and the built environment. As such, the AODA is made up of 5 standards, each addressing a different mandate, but all with the same unified purpose. Deadlines for compliance are staggered, ranging from January 1st, 2012 into 2025. The AODA applies to all levels of government, non-for-profit, and private sector businesses across Ontario who have 1 or more staff. And as the AODA is law, the Act provides for government authority to set monetary penalties to enforce compliance with the standards. The AODA was broken down into 5 stages, or standards as they are appropriately referred to. Each standard addresses a different mandate or focus. The Customer Service Standard was the first stage introduced, and all obligated organizations should have already met the requirements. On June 3, 2011, the Ontario government released the final Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. This regulation combined accessibility standards in 3 areas: information and communication, employment, and transportation. The Information and Communication Standard is the focus of this training module and will be addressed throughout. The Employment Standard sets out requirements for businesses and organizations making accessibility a regular part of finding, hiring, and supporting employees with disabilities. The Transportation Regulation is limited in its scope, applying to modes of transportation under the jurisdiction of municipal and provincial governments. The standard provides that transportation services must be provided in accessible vehicles or equivalent services made available upon request. The Built Environment Standard focuses on removing barriers in buildings and public spaces, such as beaches, recreation trails, parking spaces, and outdoor play areas. Enhancement to accessibility in new or retrofit buildings have already started to be mandated through Ontario's Building Code, which governs new construction and renovations in buildings such as entrances, doorways, and corridors. To date, the Built Environment Standard has taken on numerous versions, and it is still unclear what exactly we should expect in the way of regulation and requirements. The Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, or IASR, is made up of 3 distinct standards with their own specific requirements. The IASR also includes a section of general requirements that apply to all the standards in the regulation. The general requirements to be fulfilled by all obligated organizations are the establishment of accessibility policies and necessary accessibility plans, the establishment of accessibility measures as it relates to the procuring or acquiring of goods, services, or facilities, regulations regarding the accessibility and specifications of self-service kiosks, employer-provided training to designated employees for both the 3 standards that make up the IASR and training in human rights awareness as it relates to those persons with a disability. And the IASR also outlines the cases where there would be an exemption from filing accessibility reports. The first general requirement that applies across all standards is the establishment of accessibility policies and plans. Every obligated organization must develop, implement, and maintain policies governing how the organization will achieve accessibility through these requirements. In addition, public sector and large organizations, which is defined as an organization with 50 or more employees for the purpose of the AODA, must establish and maintain a multi-year accessibility plan, which outlines the organization's strategy to prevent and remove barriers and meet its requirements under this regulation. The plan must be posted on the organization's website and must be provided in an accessible format upon request. This plan must be reviewed every 5 years, and necessary updates must be made within that time frame. For large employers, the accessibility plan will be posted along with or in addition to the Statement of Commitment. The AODA Customer Service Standard required all large organizations to develop, maintain, and post a Statement of Commitment which describes its accessibility policies, practices, and procedures, and makes the public aware that the accessible customer service is available to all persons upon request. The document should be posted at a conspicuous location, ideally where the customer would first require customer service, and/or it may be posted on the organization's website. In addition to the requirement for accessibility policies and plans, the standard mandates that obligated organizations must incorporate accessibility criteria when procuring or acquiring goods, services, and facilities. The new expectation is that in the process of purchasing or acquiring new goods, services, or facilities, the requirement to provide accessible services will be taken into account. For example, it may be that time for your company to reconsider your advertising campaign. This regulation would require you to consider the barriers in your print and communication materials that may pose a challenge for persons with disabilities. Examples of barriers in printed materials would be small print, unclear fonts, or shades of colors that may worsen the effects of color blindness. A kiosk is a small, self-standing structure that people can use for a variety of functions, including commerce, information, education, etc. When most people think of a kiosk, they likely refer to a bank machine or an auto checkout at their local grocery store. Kiosks have taken on a much larger use in today's society and can be used for anything from updating or renewing your driver's license to quickly getting across an international border. In realization that the use of self-service kiosks is heightened in today's world, the IASR places accessibility requirements on both private and public sector organizations when designing or purchasing kiosks. Public sector organizations are now required to incorporate accessibility features when designing, purchasing, or acquiring self-service kiosks. All other businesses in Ontario must consider accessibility when designing, purchasing, or acquiring self-service kiosks. The IASR does not specify which accessibility features must be included in the self-service kiosk. However, the regulation mandates organizations must consider what accessibility features they can build into their kiosks to best meet the needs of their customers and clients. Examples of these types of considerations by organizations may include providing audio instructions in addition to visual prompts on the screen. Consider the height and stability of the kiosk. A kiosk may also be designed with specialized screens or keypads, for example, a keypad in Braille. All applicable organizations must train employees and volunteers about each regulation. All organizations must provide awareness training to all employees covering the Ontario Human Rights Code as it relates to people with disabilities. It should be noted that Ontario Human Rights Awareness training is not covered in this module. Even if you are in an obligated organization, not all employees are necessarily required to be trained in the respective regulations. Training must be provided to those who participate in developing the organization's policies and all those who provide goods, services, or facilities on behalf of the organization. There are exceptions to the accessibility requirements outlined in the legislation. The Information and Communication Standard does not apply to products and product labels, information that the organization does not control directly or indirectly through a contractual relationship unless your organization is involved in the education or training as defined in this regulation. Information and communication where it is simply not possible to convert. This generally applies to circumstances where the technology to convert the information is not readily or reasonably available. A few important considerations must be accounted for in light of these exceptions, however. If your organization has been deemed to have unconvertible information or communication formats, then upon request of the customer, the vendor should provide both the reason why the information or communications are unconvertible and a summary of all unconvertible information or communications. As well, although products and labels are exempt from the accessibility requirements, it is still the responsibility of the vendor to take a person's accessibility requirements into account when communicating with the customer regarding the product. Now that we have addressed the common requirements of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, we will move to the specific requirements laid out in the Information and Communication Standard. The goal of the Information and Communication Standard is to outline how organizations will be required to create, provide, and receive information in a way that is accessible to people with disabilities. When requested by a person with a disability, the organization must provide an accessible form of communication that takes into account the specific needs of the individual. These alternative formats and communication supports must be provided or arranged by the organization at no additional cost to the person and in a timely manner. If you consider the focus of the customer service standard, which was to provide service to their customers in a way that is accessible to people with all types of disabilities, the Information and Communication Standard takes it a step further. More than providing accessible customer service, the Information and Communication Standard's goal is to make outbound information and communications accessible as well. It is the next step towards achieving the goal of an accessible Ontario. There are numerous requirements set out in the Information and Communication Standard. We will now turn to addressing these requirements that are mandatory for all obligated organizations. The primary focus of the Information and Communication Standard is to create, provide, and receive information in a way that is accessible to people with disabilities. Every person in disability is different. Even customers that share the same disability may have different methods or tools they use so to be able to access communications and information. Thus, when requested, organizations must consult with the person to determine their accessibility needs and provide a solution that suits each individual. And as already stated, any accessible or alternative formats requested and provided by an organization must be provided in a timely manner and at no additional cost to the person. It should be noted the employer does have the flexibility to determine the most appropriate accessible format or communication support depending on the accessibility needs of the person and the capability of the organization to deliver. For example, where a person may request a specific type of accessible format, however, an alternative, less expensive format can be provided in a timely manner and ultimately provide the person with the access to the information and communication they are entitled to under this regulation, the organization may choose to offer the less expensive alternative. Alternative formats refers to the ways in which information is communicated other than through standard text. As people's disabilities and abilities vary, so too do the options that people and organizations can look to provide accessible information and communication. Most often, when people think of an example of alternative means of communication, Braille, or perhaps even sign language may come to mind. However, there are many more options, both more simple than the use of sign language and more technologically advanced than the system that is Braille. In addition to sign language and Braille, Other examples of alternative formats and communication supports include reading written information to a person directly. This often is the most practical alternative method of communication for both the person and the organization, as it is of little expense and very timely. The use of large print, clear and concise fonts, and dark print on white backgrounds in printed materials. Text transcripts of audio or visual information. Handwritten notes can be provided rather than communicating a message through speech. Closed captioning translates the audio portion of a video presentation by way of subtitles or captions, which usually appear on the bottom of the screen, or an electronic document formatted to be accessible for use with a screen reader. In addition to the requirements regarding the provisions of alternative accessible formats, the Information and Communication Standard lays out a number of other specific requirements for organizations. All obligated organizations, including private organizations with 50 or more employees, must take measures to ensure their web content is accessible to persons with disabilities. Web content generally refers to the information on a web page or a web application, including, but not limited to, text, images, and forms. The standards that must be met are called the Worldwide Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or for short, WCAG version 2.0. In addition, the standard requires that all organizations that prepare emergency procedures, plans, or public safety information must provide this information in accessible formats or the option for accessible formats upon request. Organizations are also responsible to provide individual emergency response information to employees who have identified that they have a disability and may require accommodation in the case of an emergency. The Information and Communication Standard also provides for specific requirements as it relates to educational and training resources, training for educators, and requirements for libraries. We will briefly address the sector-specific requirements near the end of this module. In today's world, the internet and an organization's website is the primary medium of information and communication. As such, the Information and Communication Standard required that government, public, and private sector organizations with 50 or more employees must make their website and web content accessible. Obligated organizations must conform with the Worldwide Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0. as outlined in the standard. The purpose is to make websites and content increasingly accessible to a broader range of users with disability. Compliance with the WCAG guidelines will mark a significant step towards accessible websites that are inclusive to all users, regardless of web browsing experience or any disability they may have. The timelines for implementation of these regulations is staggered. As of January 1st, 2014, any new public website or existing website that have been significantly refreshed, as well as any websites that have posted new web content after January 1st, 2012, must have already complied with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 Level A. As of January 1st, 2021, all public websites and web content posted after January 1st, 2012 must meet WCAG 2.0 Level AA. It is best practice for any organization that is making changes or updating their website to be proactive and comply with the full regulations due in 2021 before you are forced to do so. The Worldwide Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines explain how to make websites and web content more accessible. The guidelines are technical, and most organizations will rely on information technology professionals to implement the requirements. However, even if you are not IT savvy, the changes that are required by the standard can be easily appreciated given practical examples. Examples of the changes that organizations will institute to make their websites and content more accessible include: backgrounds are made to provide clear contrast to the color of the text, so to make it easier to read. White backgrounds for black text is always a desirable option. Websites should have alternative means of navigation, ensure that your website not only can be navigated with a mouse, but also can be navigated with a keyboard or even voice control. Presentations should not rely on a single sensory characteristic. Avoid using a flash or blinking images. Provide text transcriptions for audio recordings and captions for videos. Links describes its purpose accurately by itself or within the content of the links. And paragraphs and sentences should be kept short and written in plain, concise language. The standard requires that organizations take necessary steps to address accessibility in their emergency procedures. All organizations that prepare emergency procedures, plans, or public safety information that are available to the public must provide such information in an accessible format upon request. Examples of emergency information include emergency plans and procedures, maps, warning signs, and evacuation routes, information you give the public about alarms or other emergency alerts. The Act also requires that every employer will provide individualized workplace emergency response information to employees who have a disability and require accommodation in the case of an emergency. It is important for both the employer and employee who may require an accommodation to understand that the employer's obligation to create individual emergency plans kicks in when the employer becomes aware of the need for accommodation due to an employee's disability. Most often, the employee who requires accommodation will inform the employer of their disability. However, in some circumstances, this may not be the case. Employers are encouraged to educate everyone on the need and requirement for individual emergency work plans as per the standard. Best practice would then be to ask all employees if such a need exists for any one of them. Through employee training, such as this training module, employees will be aware of the employer's obligation and the reason they need to inform their employer of the need for an accommodation. Employers may also take the opportunity to distribute or post a memo encouraging employees to come forward if they would require accommodation due to their disability. Upon the employer being made aware of the need, the employer should work with the employee to create an appropriate, safe procedure for emergency situations. The accessibility standard for customer service mandated that organizations put into place a feedback process, so customers with a disability may provide feedback regarding the accessibility measures taken as it relates to their ability to access goods and services. The Information and Communication Standard now requires that you make this process or processes accessible. As of January 1st, 2016, all organizations, regardless of size, were to be compliant with this regulation. As with all feedback processes, it is important that the organization treat the information provided in a thoughtful and meaningful way. Feedback should be examined for the merit of the content, and if deemed necessary or desirable, action should be taken. The organization should also respond to the person providing the feedback, outlining the process of consideration, the outcome of the process, what actions were taken, if any, and the reason for the organization's decisions. Through appropriate feedback and an integrity-based process to review and action suggestions, a more accessible Ontario can be realized. The Information and Communication Standard also provides for sector-specific requirements. The sectors which are impacted by the regulations are educational and training institutions, producers of education and training materials, and public libraries. Educational and training institutions include elementary and secondary schools, as well as colleges and universities. There are specific requirements for educational and training institutions as it relates to educational and training materials, training of educators, and libraries specifically for these institutions. Over the next few slides, we will briefly focus on these requirements. The first responsibility for educational and training institutions is the requirement to provide accessible education and training resources. These organizations are required to provide needed resources in an accessible format that takes into account the needs of the person with a disability. In addition, these organizations must also provide student records and information on program requirements, availability, and descriptions in an accessible format. Ideally, Institutions will have these accessible formats and options available for students in advance of a request. However, upon request, organizations are obligated to ensure an accessible format that suits the specific needs of the individual is made available. The intent behind the requirement is that all educational and training institutions will provide students who have disabilities educational and training resources, student records, and course and program information, all in accessible formats. Similar to the requirement placed on educational and training institutions, producers of such materials must also provide accessible or conversion-ready versions upon request. Educational and training facilities must also train their educators in the regulations laid out in the standard. This training must address accessible course delivery and instruction. The training should be provided to all employees who are responsible for the design, delivery, and/or instruction of courses with strategies to enhance accessible teaching methods as a way to enrich the learning experience for students with disabilities. Finally, both libraries that are directly associated with educational and training facilities and the public libraries are subject to requirements under the Information and Communication Standard. Libraries of educational or training institutions must provide an accessible or conversion-ready format of print, digital, or multimedia resources or materials upon request. Public libraries, upon request, must provide accessible materials when possible and make the public aware that accessible materials are available upon request. You have completed the assigned training module. You will now be required to take a quiz to affirm your completion and understanding of the content of this module. A score of 70% is required to pass the quiz. Upon completion of the quiz, you will be notified if you have passed or if you are required to take the training again. You are permitted one additional opportunity to repeat the training and pass the quiz should you fail the first time. Good luck.